Coming to America is a comedy starring Eddie Murphy as the wealthy prince of the fictional African nation Zamunda. He is unhappy with the upcoming plans for his arranged marriage and convinces his father to let him travel to America before settling down with the woman they've chosen for him. Once there, he disguises himself as non-royalty, gets a job as a fast food janitor, and falls in love with his boss's daughter. I wasn't sure what to expect from this getting into it. I'm on and off about Eddie Murphy, and I wasn't sure if an 80s comedy would be leaning into or avoiding tropes about African countries that could sit badly with us today. Fortunately, it all works pretty well, and I attribute so much of that to Murphy's performance. His character is often naive or misinformed, but he's never stupid, so he comes off as someone genuinely trying to learn something new and improve at it, not a character to be mocked for misunderstanding. And he's also such a sincere, charming character, something I've never really seen in a performance from Murphy before. I seldom laughed out loud at this movie, but I smiled a lot, and I rooted fiercely for this character. I'm glad I finally watched it. In the Heights is the film adaptation of Lin-Manuel Miranda's first Broadway musical before Hamilton. It follows a Washington Heights block populated by mostly Latino immigrants, and we follow their lives and dreams. Usnavi is trying to move back to the Dominican Republic, Vanessa is trying to get a swanky downtown apartment and focus on fashion design, and Nina is coming back after her first year at Stanford, the first in her neighborhood to go to college. I was so excited for this movie when I first heard it announced, and it met every expectation I had, and then some. The story, music, and casting were already set to be great, but the cinematography elevates it to a whole new level, something completely different than you'd get in a stage production, using fantastical angles and effects to visually convey the themes of the songs. This took my breath away in songs like Paciencia y Fe, where an elderly woman muses on her past. In the literal world of the film, she's lying in bed remembering, but the film takes her wandering among stylized versions of the places and people that formed her life. I don't have enough time to rave about all of this film. I just know that it brought smiles to my face and tears to my eyes, and I would recommend it in a heartbeat. Moonlight is the Oscar-winning story of a young gay black man growing up. We see his story in 3 segments. One where he is a child trying to get away from his abusive, drug-addicted mother, one when he is a teenager being bullied in school, and one when he is an adult, reconnecting with people from his past. I really wanted to fall in love with this movie. I love when film tells the stories of people on the margins in thoughtful and compassionate ways, and this definitely does that. Ultimately, though, while I find the first 2/3 of the movie extremely compelling, I struggle a little bit to connect the final third. I can't quite process the ending section and what I'm meant to take away from it the same way that I can with the first 2. I'm completely willing to believe that that's a fault on my end rather than the film's, and the lack of ending resolution is quite possibly the only fitting finale the story can take. I wonder a bit if the original play, which had all 3 segments happening simultaneously, would help it sit more definitively for me. Regardless, even if it didn't quite work for me, others should see it. The main character is compelling, and the cinematography is captivating, and it's a story that doesn't get told often. Those Who Wish Me Dead follows 2 characters whose lives converge. A forest firefighter who is haunted by her past firefighting failures, played by Angelina Jolie, and a child whose father has helped uncover an enormous corruption scandal and is being pursued by hitmen. When the hitmen catch up to the child and his father, the child is left to reveal the corruption on his own. He crosses paths with Jolie's forest ranger, who agrees to help him, and things go from there. This movie is very middle of the road. The most interesting pieces of it by far are the villains, who have a sort of cold ruthlessness that we've seen in film before, but somehow seems more out of place here, and therefore more malicious. There's a strange bit in the middle that seems to be centering around how difficult it is to be a firefighter, and that doesn't seem to fit in with the rest of the story. This isn't a bad movie per se, but it's very forgettable, and it just isn't going to linger in my mind beyond this one viewing. Flora Ulysses is a Disney film about a young girl whose parents are separated. One day, she finds a squirrel who appears to be able to communicate in writing, and she decides he's a superhero. So she, her dad, and her next-door neighbor set out to find out his superhero purpose. This is a spectacularly silly premise that doesn't distinguish itself very much, aside from filling the film with a great comedic cast. When I was talking to my husband about this, he pointed out that it features all the voice actors for the kids in the new DuckTales, and yeah, the kid ducks are just all in this movie. Ben Schwartz is especially unexpectedly great as the father, bringing just the right combination of optimism and seriousness to this role. And the character of the next-door neighbor, who becomes the sidekick, is also a great character, with some very funny one-liners that made me laugh out loud several times. This is, however, definitely a movie for children, with mostly children's jokes and children's stakes, when there are stakes at all, so there's not a lot to recommend it to adults aside from, Ben Schwartz's surprisingly good performance and the child's sidekick. It's adequate, but unspectacular. Army of the Dead is Zack Snyder's second zombie-themed movie after Dawn of the Dead. This one focuses on a zombie infestation that manages to be contained within the newly built walls of Las Vegas, which the government then plans to nuke to get rid of all the zombies once and for all. A group of thieves are hired to break into the zombie-run city, steal millions of dollars from one of the casino vaults, and make it back out all before the bomb is dropped. While I really enjoyed the high-energy horror sequences in Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, this one falls a little flat for me. It feels more like watching someone play a video game than anything else. That's not always a bad thing, but here I find it disorienting. Like, it makes all the character development around it seem like cutscenes, the kind that are mostly filler until you get to the part where you could actually fight, and it undercuts any hope at emotional catharsis and leaves the whole thing feeling a little cold. Dawn of the Dead didn't have many emotional underpinnings either, but the action scenes there at least felt exciting. Here, they're dimly lit and edited too fast to really catch anything that's happening. Overall, disappointing. The Anderson Tapes stars Sean Connery as a thief released from jail only to immediately start planning a new robbery. His plans and the heist itself are captured almost entirely by various surveillance agencies watching for other things that happen to intersect with his actions, but since none of them are communicating with each other, the heist continues unchecked. This is more interesting in concept than it is in execution. The surveillance of the characters is so ever-present, but it feels more like a gimmick than anything thematically cohesive. Like the initial idea was just a straightforward crime heist movie, and then someone said this needs something extra, so they threw this at it. The crime did need something extra, but I'm not sure that was it. Connery is enjoyable enough as the lead here, though it's Martin Balsam who is most captivating, playing the amiable gay antique store owner whose job is to assess what is and isn't worth stealing. This is one of those rare movies that I think would benefit from a remake. The moral questions of surveillance are more relevant than ever, and integrating it further into the story thematically could make something very compelling. The Crow, on its surface, is a familiar story. A man and his girlfriend are killed in a home invasion, and a year later he rises from his grave to take his revenge on the killers. What sets this film apart from other horror movies of the same ilk is mostly that it clearly isn't actually intended to be a horror movie. Such empathy is shown toward the main character, the undead Avenger, that we're obviously meant to be rooting for him, and it makes for an interesting ride. It brought back such incredibly strong, moody goth teen in the late 90s vibes for me. I could almost read the fan fiction written by young girls fantasizing that Eric or other hot guys in dramatic makeup would show up and avenge their bullies. It was like I was back in the days of my greatest Phantom of the Opera obsession. Funny how a movie you've never seen can bring back an entire era of your life. The story itself is more generic revenge action story, but the way it treats its main character to clearly appeal to teenage girls gives it a slightly different twist, which is enjoyable to watch play out. I had way more fun with this than I thought I would. It was a whole nostalgic ride that I'd never expected. Willy's Wonderland is an absolutely ridiculous horror film about a children's restaurant that has been closed down ever since a group of serial killers transferred their consciousnesses into the animatronics. The town locks Nicolas Cage up in the restaurant with the promise of him earning the money he needs to fix his car, but in reality they want the animatronics to kill him. And we also see a story play out with the local sheriff's adopted daughter, who has decided to gather some friends and take matters into their own hands. This is, as I said up front, absolutely ridiculous. The premise alone is ludicrous enough, but then we do in fact get these amazing scenes of Nicolas Cage just wordlessly battling animatronic gorillas or ostriches or whatever else there is, and it's just a whirlwind of goofy. It is the right kind of goofy, though. It's just having such a very good time playing around with this concept and letting it be exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. If anything, the ever so slightly more grounded subplots of the teenagers actually drags it down a little bit, but not much, and it all ends with a truly satisfying climactic scene. This movie knows exactly what it wants to be, and it goes for it. Casualties of War is a Vietnam War movie directed by Brian De Palma. It follows a group of soldiers who, traumatized by a recent death and high on American exceptionalism, kidnap a Vietnamese woman to take with them into the jungle on assignment. Michael J. Fox plays the only soldier in this small group of 5 who refuses to rape her, and this places a target on his back, especially when the woman becomes a liability and his commanding officer, played by Sean Penn, murders her. This is a heavy watch, and much less sensationalized than I would have expected from De Palma. This is the first dramatic performance I think I've seen of Fox's, and he does well, bringing a desperate earnestness to the role that really helps us sympathize with him and his sense of helplessness, like there's nothing he can do for this woman. John C. Reilly plays one of the other soldiers in this small group, and it's fascinating to watch his character change from someone friendly and amiable into someone way too okay with committing atrocities. The film isn't perfect, but it's a very solid effort that does something a little bit different from the rest of the genre. For Love of the Game is a drama starring Kevin Costner as a major league pitcher for the Detroit Tigers, who is given the opportunity to retire after 19 years when his team is sold and the new owners don't want him. The film jumps between what is potentially his last game and his memories in a flashback over the last several years of his life, showing us how his love for baseball has made it difficult for him to maintain a romantic relationship. I'm not entirely convinced that the two halves of this movie, the ball game and the flashback, play together as well as the film wants them to. But more importantly, the character of Billy Chapel is not nearly likable enough or interesting enough to hold my attention for 2 hours. He's a pretty self-centered jerk, but not in any way that invites thoughtfulness or reflection, and I'm not even entirely sure the film is aware that he's unlikable. We might be supposed to sympathize with him more. The scenes with the ongoing baseball game are by far the most interesting, since it doesn't require us to care very much about his character, just enjoy the excitement of the athletic achievement. This is not one to go out of your way to see, unless you really love baseball. Palmer stars Justin Timberlake as the title character, a convict out on parole who moves back in with his grandmother. When she unexpectedly passes away, Palmer finds himself needing to take her place as the one taking care of the next-door neighbor's young son, whose mom frequently runs off on drug binges. He ends up connecting with the young boy, who prefers princesses and tea parties to more masculine pursuits, and this makes him a target of bullying in their rural southern town. There are some good scenes and some good characters and themes in here, although it's all overshadowed a little bit by how very hard it seems to be working for a Best Actor nomination for Timberlake. His dramatic monologue in the courthouse, which ultimately serves very little narrative purpose, was such an obviously forced Best Actor moment that I found it distracting. There are actually a lot of pieces of this that feel forced, particularly toward the end when the film scrambles to get everything in order for the conclusion, but so many of the little pieces actually are well done. I like many of the individual scenes, and I like how the trope of falling back in with an old crowd takes on different meanings here than it does in most crime movies. Not a bad watch, but it's got its flaws. Wrath of Man is a Guy Ritchie action thriller starring Jason Statham as a man who gets a job driving armored trucks for banks. There's been a gang of thieves hijacking these trucks and stealing the money lately, and Statham turns out to be surprisingly good at taking them down. There's more to his backstory that we learn as the story goes on, but that gets into spoiler territory, so I'll leave it here for now. I will say that the backstory serves almost no useful purpose here. We spent a lot of time on it, and I think it's supposed to add some emotional resonance to the film's third act, but it's mostly just unnecessarily complicated and redirects the story to kind of a strange place. The action sequences here are competent. I guess in the simplest terms, this is exactly what you'd expect from a Guy Ritchie, Jason Statham action thriller. So if that's something you already really love, this one will probably work for you too. If that's not a particularly engaging combo, as it isn't for me, this isn't going to change your mind about any of that. Lil Abner is the film adaptation of the musical adaptation of the long-running Lil Abner comic strip. The setting is the extremely rural and southern and redneck town of Dogpatch, USA, which is set to be evacuated and used as an atom bomb test site if the residents can't come up with a reason why Dogpatch provides a necessary service to the US. This movie is a wild, weird ride, and it absolutely makes sense that it was modeled after a comic strip because it brings all those elements directly into the film. The sets are mostly large, flat-painted backgrounds, which yes is definitely paying tribute to the stage show, but also very much gives it a two-dimensional feel throughout. And the acting, well, it's not subtle. These are the most hammed-up stereotypical performances I've seen in a while. Sometimes it becomes way too much, sometimes it's sort of endearingly ridiculous. The songs are pretty good, if sometimes forgettable, with solid character performances. It's almost impossible to know whether or not to recommend this, or even whether I even liked it. But I guess I always have to admire a film so determined to just be itself. The Last Laugh is a silent film about an unnamed doorman at a fancy hotel who is demoted to washing room attendant when it's deemed he is too old and frail to perform his doorman duties. He is ashamed of the demotion and tries to hide it from his family and friends, which doesn't go well. It's hard to talk about this film without sort of spoiling the ending, but I'll try to keep it vague enough to not give any of the details away. I had a mixed reaction to this one. This film is not only silent in terms of no audible character voices, but it has only a single title card in the third act, and the rest is told solely in visuals. And since I'm someone who responds very strongly to dialogue, I had a tough time getting into it because of that. I kept getting bored and tuning out and having to rewind. That's a me problem, though, not a movie problem, and I have to say I came around to it in the third act. Again, attempting no spoilers, but the movie culminates with a fascinating combination of hope and hopelessness that suddenly captured my imagination and my emotions. I wouldn't be surprised if rewatching the film in light of this ending would be a new experience, so I'll have to try and make room to do that sometime. Oxygen is a French-language sci-fi mystery. A woman wakes up in some sort of cryogenic pod that she cannot leave, where the computer informs her that she only has 40% oxygen left. She has no idea who she is, let alone how she got there, and she has to use her brains and the little information the computer passes on to her to figure out if she can escape before she runs out of oxygen. This draws an immediate comparison to the Ryan Reynolds film Buried from 2010, but while Buried felt like it was primarily leaning on the horror thriller part of its genre, here it feels about equal parts mystery and thriller. There's obviously a pressing danger throughout the story, but the mystery of who this woman is and how she got here takes up just as much bandwidth. And ultimately, it's the unraveling of that mystery that really made this film work for me most. She's a good protagonist for this genre in that she makes smart, logical decisions while also clearly portraying how this traumatic situation is affecting her. Overall, this is definitely one I would recommend. Ouija House is your typical cabin-in-the-woods demon possession movie. A group of college students go to a house that one girl's family owns, where bad things supposedly happened there once, and they begin using a Ouija board to try and contact the spirits. This genre can occasionally be fun, but very often it follows the same pattern to the point where there's nothing genuinely scary happening in it. This is much more the latter, particularly because the characters are such a letdown here, and we're relying on them since the plot isn't new. They don't have personalities, and they're forced into making illogical decisions to extend the tension when really it deflates it, because then I get distracted, thinking, wait, why are they going back into the house? Why aren't they trying to get to a hospital right now? There's also the problem that since so much of the story revolves around Ouija board readings, a lot of the scary scenes are just spelling out a potential threat one visual letter at a time. That works early on, and the film does its best to speed up these revelations later, but it still makes it difficult to raise the stakes as the story goes on. There's nothing to recommend this one over other similar stories. Inherent Vice is a Paul Thomas Anderson movie starring Joaquin Phoenix as a stoner PI in the 1970s, who is hired for various jobs, all of which seem to be connected in some way. Anderson and I have an interesting director-audience relationship. I frequently find his movies baffling, not because they're outrageous, but because they actually seem so normal until it gets to the end and I realize that I can't put all the pieces together. There Will Be Blood and Magnolia work for me. The Master and Phantom Thread don't. And this one lands with the latter. It takes my least favorite part of crime noirs, the exhaustingly windy threads connecting the plot, and my least favorite part of Anderson's work, a bunch of possible themes all fighting each other, and combines them together. Its one saving grace for me was that it had much more humor scattered throughout than I expected, from the hilariously unlikely character names to truly funny lines of dialogue that felt like they were pulled from a different movie. This feels like it has the makings of a cult classic, and like most cult classics, it's not going to be beloved by all, and it certainly isn't by me, but it feels like something someone else could really love. The Pawnbroker is my next movie in my journey to watch through the films of Sidney Lumet. This one focuses on Saul Nazarman, a Jewish pawnbroker who survived the World War II concentration camps and is now bitter and closed off toward humanity. Various people in his story try to reach out to him to connect in some way, but his trauma keeps him pushing them away. I really love when Lumet does these narrowly focused character-centric stories. He manages to get inside his characters' heads and convey so much about them with very little. That absolutely happens here. Even as Nazarman treats everyone around him poorly, the film brings out such empathy for him by showing how absolutely miserably trapped he is, how he can't escape what happened to him in the past, how he doesn't know how to move forward from seeing the worst of humanity. It's not just about him, though. The side characters also make every moment they're on screen interesting. And then we have the wide array of characters who come into the shop to pawn their items. Such a rich tapestry of characters, any of whom I could have spent more time with. And I haven't even had time to talk about the cinematography or the use of sound in this film, so I'll just have to close by saying I was deeply moved by this.